Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. I left Vancouver because lately everything in the city had started to feel like an exam I hadn't studied for. My thesis supervisor stopped replying to my emails. My roommate moved out and took half my furniture. And Claire, she left on a Thursday and took the clothes she'd never folded. I drove east with a duffel bag and a guitar that had mostly sat collecting dust. Then I got a message from Malene, my cousin. Do you want a house sit? Free heat, no tutors, no people. Her father, Uncle Hank, had a property in Elkford, up there where the roads turn rough and the town has more trucks than stoplights. I figured a month of snow and silence might be enough to decide whether I kept going with the PhD or walked away. I arrived at a 2-story cabin, painted the color of old bones with a wood stove bold enough to make the kitchen smell like home. Maddie greeted me at the door in a wool scarf and that smile of hers that still made me feel 13. Hank was in the kitchen, his cigarette reduced to a stub between 2 fingers, moving the way a man moves when he's earned every line in his face. They were glad to see me. I was glad to be needed. The locals, though, looked at me with that expression people give you when you show up to a battle holding a map. At Jansen's gas station, the cashier, an older woman with a braid down to her waist, asked about Hank in a way that was heavy with unsaid sentences. When I mentioned I was staying on his property, the man's jaw tightened, like I'd confessed I planned to bring an animal into a church. Someone said, "Don't go near the canal at night." They said it like a weather warning. No one laughed. During the first week, everything fit into the silence like a perfect glove. I wrote a paragraph or 2 a day, fired off emails into an empty folder, and slept without the city's hum. It was like someone had finally turned the static off, but then things started going missing. At first it was small stuff. A headlamp I used for camping, Maddie's winter boots that had been on the porch, the AA batteries from the remote. We joked. Hank muttered something about raccoons. Maddie said she was losing her mind, but when nothing ever turned up again, the jokes lost their weight. Doors that had been shut later showed up cracked open. Windows that were latched let drafts through, like someone had discovered a new way to breathe. At certain hours you could hear a soft whistling. At first I blamed the wind, until Hank went completely still, staring at the window like it had cut him. One night it rained and that rain froze into fog. I woke up to the sound of locks catching down the hallway, door after door, following a pattern, like someone was counting. I found Hank at the back window, smearing a dark, muddy paste around the frames and hinges, his hands shaped by the earth. I asked what he was doing. He looked at me with eyes I didn't recognize and said, "The rain makes it hungry." That wasn't an answer. It was a confession. The whistling settled into a schedule, 3 notes at 3:05 a.m., 3 thin exact whistles that made Maddie flinch even when she pretended she didn't. Once I followed the sound in slippers and found a perfect circle of disturbed dirt in her bedroom, right in the center of the wooden floor, like someone had punched the boards with a coffee can. Maddie swore she'd slept straight through and woke up with dirty palms and a bruise on her wrist. I wanted to believe someone was messing with us, that it was a prank we could expose. Instead, I felt a pressure in my chest I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I rubbed. Hank got worse. He started sitting by the back door with a shotgun and a paper cup of coffee beside him, already cold. He watched the canal through the frost, jaw tight, and sometimes he spoke to the dark like it was a dog he couldn't stand to abandon. "You don't come in," he'd whisper. "You don't come into what's in here." Once he turned to me and said, "Remember the people who listen." I tried to document what was happening in sensible ways. Photos of the damp ring in Maddie's room, notes about the missing objects, timestamps for the whistles. The images came out dull. The circle barely showed as a shadow, and photos of the back lot, where the canal cut a shallow, toothless trench, turned blurry right in the center, like the lens had forgotten how to focus on the earth. I posted a question on a local forum and got no response. The next morning, the thread was gone, and then Hank disappeared. It happened during a cold snap that squeezed the air until it felt like crystal. We went to bed with the windows sealed and the shotgun by the door where he always left it. At dawn, his boots were on the porch, one lace undone, the heel scraped. There were faint drag marks on the snow leading toward the canal, stopping right at the edge. Like something had taken one last look and decided not to go further. Hank's footprints didn't reappear on the other side. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing. Just a pair of boots and an absence the size of an adult. Maddie blamed herself. She blamed me. I blamed the part of me that had believed a month was enough to fix a life. We went into town and reported it. The RCMP was kind but clinical. They took notes and asked about enemies, debts, alcohol. The report got filed. The locals looked away. On the aerial maps of the property, there was a blank where our land should have been. A smear that made the agent on the phone laugh nervously, and he only said, "That's weird." No one wanted to list that land. No one wanted to go near it. That night, the 3 whistles came back, exact, like a metronome set to 3:05. We heard them from the truck as we fled, the red taillights cutting the fog. The whistling followed us, first faint, then layered, like it bent space, until it felt like it was inside the cab with us. The last sound before it cut out was maddeningly close, ridiculous and intimate. Back in Vancouver, I tried to stitch my world together again. The city hadn't missed me. My phone filled with messages from colleagues and a few worried friends. I took a temp job shelving books, sat under fluorescent lights, and pretended the whistles weren't a living thing folded inside my ribs. But they came anyway. Not from outside, but in sleep. Always at 3:05 a.m. 3 exact notes and the pressure of something waiting right at the edge of a hearing. The sleep paralysis started. My back pinned to the mattress, my own breathing booming in my ears, the sense that the darkness in my room had sharpened. I told myself it was stress. Post-traumatic stress disorder packed neatly and academically. And then I'd think of Hank smearing mud and saying the rain made it hungry. Suddenly, stress felt like too small a word for the real shape of things. Sometimes I dream. I'm standing at the canal just once and there's a sound like earth swallowing. Other nights I hear the 3 whistles and I'm back in the truck with Maddie, both of us half crying and half laughing at the absurdity of something we can't explain. The last time I went back alone for a weekend to take what we could. Maddie left one single pair of Hank's boots by the porch. I took them, put them in a box, and carried them up to the attic. Every few nights, those boots creak like someone is sliding a foot into leather that wants to walk. I don't know if the earth remembers those who listen, or if memory itself is a trick the darkness plays when it gets tired of being watched. I only know this. Places are haunted by more than ghosts. They're haunted by abandoned decisions, by the way people lean toward fear and refuse to leave. Elkford taught me that. It taught me that listening can be, by itself, an invitation. That ignored fear can deepen until it becomes harm. We owe it to each other, to notice, to speak, and to act before what we neglect remembers us back. Story 2. I used to think traveling was like hitting a reset button. Growing up in Winnipeg made me associate highway miles with freedom. Endless lanes of empty prairie, where problems got sharpened, like the air itself, and you could pretend the next town would fix what was breaking back home. Bowling felt similar. A private rhythm under the bright lights of the alley. The pins lined up neatly, waiting for someone to set them right again. By the time I turned 26, I'd learned how rough both things could be. That reset button didn't always work. You could drive until your arms ached and still carry the mess with you. Jordan and I left early, heading east in an old rented SUV, one of those that drank oil and spit steam every time the temperature climbed. He joked about my frown and the way I checked the coolant like it was a newborn. But losing my job sat on my chest like a stone. I'd spent months bowling more out of stubbornness than enjoyment. This trip to Moose Jaw felt like swallowing a small, ridiculous hope. Maybe a good showing would pull me back from the edge. By the time Highway 1 started unspooling under our wheels, the sky had gone flat and white, and the heat lay on the land in a way that made it feel like you were driving inside a sealed oven. The silos near Howren stood up like shells, the shadow of a town that wasn't there anymore. The radiator light flickered. Steam appeared. We pulled over and stayed there with the windows down while the sweat cooled inside the cabin into sticky droplets. "No bars," Jordan said, hunting for signal on his phone. Not a single miserable line. "Of course not," I said. I twisted the cap off the coolant bottle, stubborn, refusing to accept that the cheap rental had finally given up. The sun hammered the dashboard. A truck passed and kept going. The only visible shade was too far away, and promise alone doesn't fix an overheated engine. Then the tow truck appeared, creaking up over the rise like something out of a roadside photo. Rusty, heavy, with a faint smell of oil and nicotine. The driver leaned his head out the window. With him came a little cloud of smoke, and he shouted, "You boys need a tow." We knew what the scene looked like. Two guys stranded, sweat burning in our eyes. A man with a cigarette and a price in his head. Even so, common sense, that old tired beast, split off from desperation. "We'd rather a shop in Moose Jaw," I said. "How far?" He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, showing missing teeth. "Moose Jaw's about 30, but I don't mess with GPS out here. For 200 more, I'll tow you anywhere. Cash." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You want 420? Jordan said, doing the math wrong and then right. "Cliff," he finally called himself, shrugging like charging was an inconvenience that needed paying. We didn't have a choice. The heat, the buzzing, and the feeling of looking ridiculous on the shoulder pushed us into handing over the money. Cliff's cab smelled like stale smoke and motor oil. He drove reclined, his foot tapping a rhythm on the dash, like hauling us was entertainment more than work. He started with small talk. "Bowling, huh?" he asked, like we'd told it to everyone in a procession of tow jobs. We showed him our shirts, made jokes. I relaxed enough to smile. And then his stories changed color. He told them the way someone recites a dark script they love. "I've seen cars folded like origami," he said, and compared a crushed sedan to a peanut shell. The first story was clinical, pure crash mechanics. The second came with smell and ferocity. Burned vehicles where the passengers were still there. "Buckled in," he said, and lifted his fingers like he was feeling seatbelts. "Cliff," I blurted before I could think. "Please, could you—" "Not now," he said, and laughed low, satisfied. "You should hear about the trailer I pulled last year. Kids in the back, with blankets. You hear me? Kids." The cab vibrated with that smile. He narrated like it was a sport. Every detail, a point scored. At one point, he leaned forward and turned on the radio, letting a hiss of static fill the gaps, like it underlined his descriptions. Jordan's jaw tightened. A thick nausea rose in me, bile weaving at the back of my throat. We were thin. Meat inside a story he could shape and toss away when he got bored. "Turn it off," I said again, firmer. The tow truck kept rolling, tires whispering over scorching asphalt, and Cliff leaned back, enjoying the effect. "You can get out and walk," he said at last, casual, like he was offering any ordinary option. "About 28 clicks." He gave us the distance like someone offering you a choice between apples. Jordan and I looked at each other with something that tasted like clarity and fear. Walking in that heat, between silos and nothing, wasn't an option. The road rippled in heat mirages. We stayed, By the time we reached Moose Jaw, any trace of charm was gone. My hands were shaking. My chest felt like a fist had moved in and planned to stay forever. That night, the motel room was cooler. The air conditioning was an almost obscene blessing, but sleep came braided with repetition. In the dark, I heard Cliff's cadence, the way he savored each image. I replayed every sentence, looking for the pattern, some clue to why a man would tell those things in that voice. Was it power? A joke on the edge of sadism, or a defense? Maybe someone who'd seen too much and used shock to keep distance. In the tournament, I bowled like a man whose legs had been kicked out from under him. The ball felt wrong in my hand. Time slipped away in heartbeats. The pins that should have fallen stared back at me under cold lights. When it was all over and the scores were in red, my name sat at the bottom, like a bruise on the last line. I walked back to the car through that corridor of fluorescent lights and felt the world tipping towards something narrow and unknown. Jordan was quiet. He'd watched me lose something I'd been carrying hidden like it was mine by right. Confidence. The months after were worse, but in subtler ways. A long drive scraped my palms raw with anxiety. The smell of motor oil on my clothes snapped me back into that cab. At night, the motel curtains weren't enough. I dreamed of seatbelts tightening on their own, of scorched metal humming like a choir. I stopped taking long prairie routes. I chose the city, even if it cost me an extra hour. I told myself it was rational. Deep down, it was superstition raised by a man who smiled when we were small inside his smiling stories. Cliff became a myth in the lanes. Someone said he liked how his stories made people feel tiny. Another swore he'd been in an accident 3 towns over the same week we saw him on the shoulder. Nobody liked him. Everyone told the story as a warning to new drivers. Hearing his name in the bowling alley felt like someone shaking a jar full of nails next to your face. I learned something that day on the road. Fear lives in practical things. It isn't always about monsters. It's about small numbers and decisions that leave you at someone else's mercy. Cash only, a raised thumb and a smile, a cab that smells like old smoke. It's about being thirsty and choosing between walking or trusting a stranger who tells perfectly horrible stories. Months later, I bought a one-way bus ticket to Winnipeg with my bag full of gear and the certainty that the bowling alley lights and polished wood were better anchors for me than long, empty roads. Today, bowling is what I choose, not what I cling to because I can't see any other way out. In the lanes, I learned to listen to my own voice and to say no. Jordan still drives carefully. When we talk, he laughs loud remembering it. How we gave into the heat and the money like it was an old sin. Sometimes he asks if I want to take another trip. I say no. Not because I'm brave, but because I already know how easy it is for a toothless man with too many stories to turn a moment into a long memory. There are roads I avoid now, and not just the ones with ghost silos. I avoid the kind of story Cliff enjoyed, the one where someone else decides how much of your life they have the right to make terrifying. I learned to ask for receipts, to carry extra water, and to call a tow service if there's even the smallest margin of choice. Real safety usually comes from small, concrete acts. Trust your instincts, prepare for the predictable, and don't hand control of your fate to someone who delights in other people's misery. Story 3. My grandmother's house rises beside a lake the way an old photograph sits inside a frame. Yellowed edges, slightly warped, but holding 100 summers inside it. When I was 15, we called it Margot's house without stopping to think how many people had called it that before us, or how long it had been there watching the water. I grew up in Sherbrooke. My parents worked hard and expected education and punctuality from us. Margot belonged to another era. Dinners with art, a clipped laugh, and the kind of money that keeps the lawn always cut, and the propane tank always full. For me, that place was an escape. 3 boys, a GameCube, a lake to dive into head first in July. For Margot, though, the place had been safe. Once, and then it stopped being. 5 years before the weekend I'm about to tell you about, someone broke into the house. They didn't take anything truly important. Mom swore the only thing missing was a silver tray, but they left with something heavier, a new set of habits. After that, Margot checked every lock twice, installed a motion sensor light that made the Birches look like they were standing guard, and carried a soft expression of terror that never slipped into her voice. To us boys, she told stories about drawing the curtains at dusk, as if curtains could be armor. It became a ritual that felt more like belief. Lock the doors and maybe the world will agree to leave you alone. We arrived on a Friday with duffel bags, basketballs, and that reckless energy that makes a house feel twice as big. The Morton building, the storage barn at the end of the drive, had always been part of the property's map inside my head. A low wooden structure with a sagging roof and an oily smell. That afternoon, after a game that had us chasing each other until the sun smudged itself through the trees, we noticed the big doors were slightly ajar. None of us had touched them. Margot, who swore she'd left everything locked before we arrived, insisted that barn had been closed that very morning. We pushed the doors, leaned in, and found tools and winter furniture, along with the smell of wet earth, like someone had come in with mud on their shoes. Nothing was missing, nothing you could point at and name, but the air in there felt like someone had been there very recently and left in a hurry. That first night, fog rolled in from the lake like someone threw a blanket over the world. It muffled the porch lights of the neighboring houses until the homes looked like dim suggestions. While Margot washed dishes, I stood by the dining room window, rinsing a plate and watching the black water scrape the shore. And then I saw him. He was on the front steps like he'd been carved there, tall, soaked to the bone, barefoot, even though the air tasted like knives. The porch lamp painted him yellow. He didn't move. He didn't breathe in any way I could see. I shouted, not because he was violent, but because he had the wrong kind of stillness. Margot yanked me away from the window, her fingers closing around the skin of my wrist hard enough to hurt. "Don't look," she whispered, hissing. She locked every door in the house, and the keys turned twice with a loud jingle, like rehearsal. We called the police with shaking hands and loud breathing inside the silent kitchen. When we opened the door to check, he was already gone. He'd stepped back into the fog like someone retreating into a dream. Outside, there were only faint blurred footprints near the doors of the Morton building, the kind of prints someone would leave if they were trying hard not to be seen. The officers who came were kind in that measured, bureaucratic way adults sometimes have. They found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a fight, just those few wet marks near the barn in the fog, as if it had swallowed more than light. "Probably a lost hiker," one of them said, making a mental note. I wanted to believe him. Margot didn't. That night downstairs, while the boys upstairs traded GameCube controllers like coins, a scream split the house in two. A sound so raw it ripped sleep off your bones. Margot pointed with a trembling finger toward the office, dark and square, at the end of the hall. "He's in there," she said. And we moved like kids playing at bravery. We dragged a dresser to put it in front of the door, wedged it there with a conviction that felt insufficient against real fear. This time the police found a man on the office couch, curled like a question mark, trembling. He was soaked, shivering, and claimed, plainly, like a confession, that he'd come in through an unsecured window to shelter from the cold. He smelled like lake water, and his clothes clung to his body like he'd just come up from the shore. The officers took his statement and let him out, but there were no wet footprints tracing a path to the couch, no bent grass, no sign at all that he'd crossed the room without the house noticing. Margot, who had seen faces in the fog before, looked at the man through the crack of the front door and said, "Wrong. He's not the one I saw." After the man left, the house returned to its small, ordinary sounds, the tick of clocks, the hum of the refrigerator. Still, Margot's habits hardened. At 92, she drew the curtains at noon as if privacy were a daily necessity. and every window had to be shut against something that was waiting. We boys tried to be useful during the day, stacking firewood, sweeping the porch, laughing too loudly so silence wouldn't slip in. But when the fog rolled back from the lake, swallowing light and flattening sound, it felt like we were living on the empty reverse side of a photograph. I still remember the smell of the Morton building after someone had been inside. That mineral, wet scent, like earth pressed between fingers. I remember the puddles that 10 feet farther on weren't there at all. I remember standing on the porch watching the woods the way a man watches a road only he knows how to drive. Margot's fear was contagious. It made me doubt the rational parts of myself until they felt childish. How does someone walk around a house without being heard? How do you explain the absence of a trail? The answer always stayed just out of reach, like the story of a comet. The years have let me shape the story until I can tell it without feeling hands in the dark. I left Sherbrooke for university, for a city that buzzed with logic and proofs, and with problems you could solve with time and stubbornness. Even so, certain images follow me. The man on the steps, the blurred footprints near the Morton building, the man on the couch who smelled like the lake but left no trace. Margot died a couple of years after that weekend and her house was sold. I went once before it left the family. I walked through rooms where curtains had been drawn like armor, and everything felt smaller, as if memory had shrunk it so it could fit in my pockets. People offered explanations: lack of sleep, the kind of paranoia age brings, a prank arranged by teenagers who like scaring an old woman. Maybe there's comfort in clean, orderly answers, but what I'm left with is the feeling of how a place can feel watched, even when the eyes that watched it are gone. A house beside a lake can be a mirror, and sometimes mirrors show you things you didn't know you were ready to see. Safety isn't just locks and lights, it's the attention we give each other. When someone says they're afraid, believing them and acting matters more than dismissing what we can't easily explain. Story 4. When you camp with guys who grew up where the trees start and really never fully left, you learn to make room for someone else's memory the way you make room for a flashlight. Carefully, firmly and low, so it doesn't startle the dark. We were 3 nights into a late summer trip, the lake letting go of the heat in its skin, mixed with insects tapping Morse code into the air. My friend Mark nudged a log with his boot and said, "Have you ever heard the story of the Hargraves?" His voice tightened the circle a little more. Calvin Hargraves wasn't there. Calvin was Mark's old man. A man who'd lived almost his whole life around Temagami and could fix an outboard motor with a spoon and a prayer. But the story came out as if the forest itself leaned in to listen. Calvin told it the way you tell a map, starting with a place that doesn't show up on any modern atlas. "We lived right where the planted pines formed a wall," he said. Decades earlier, government crews had come through and planted straight rows for fiber or whatever it was. Under those trees, sunlight never fully touched the ground. It was like walking under a roof. I remember asking him, what kept them there? Why didn't they move? "Mom wasn't leaving," he said, and the fire's ember reflected in his pupils. Rent was nothing if you lived a little off the land. We had what we needed. Dad died when I was 7. Logging, handled a winch wrong. After that, his mother worked double shifts at the lake lodge. They were kids in a cabin with a wood stove and no neighbor for miles. Calvin's cadence was flat, strangely gentle. He didn't dress the story up with ghosts or theatrics. He talked about chores, about the silence of unused things, and how the pines squeezed sound inward, like a fist. That setting made whatever happened there feel inevitable. Kids with too much time in a forest that hummed. They were bored in that slow way. Kids get bored when work and adults are half a day away. "We'd go out when Mom left," Calvin said, "just to kill time. We'd make nests out of pine needles and moss, lean against the trunks, and fall asleep. His sister, older and sensible, would scold them, though she couldn't always stop them. There was a place, he went on, an old patch of pines. You felt different there. Your eyes got heavy, like the wind carried a lullaby. I asked about that lullaby. It wasn't a song, not like a radio, he explained. It was more like the trees were singing low. You could believe it was the wind, but it wasn't. It made you want to sleep, slow and safe. He tapped his knuckle on his knee to imitate the rhythm. The image stuck in me. Kids curled up on a bed of needles while the forest rocked them towards somewhere else. Sometimes when his mom came back, she'd find them asleep beside the big pine. Not on the trail, he said. Up against the trunk. She'd drag us back, chew us out, and we'd wake up like we'd been gone for hours. We never remembered walking. The way he said it, shrugging more than anything, made me think he'd spent years reconciling the ordinary with the unsettling. The night that changed everything, Calvin was 9. I woke up alone, he said. The fire crackled and popped a little. The woods beyond our camp held its usual time of day chorus turned into night. It was warm for how late it was. The moon hung like a bathtub stopper. The hum was louder. He sat up and saw a figure, tall, broader than a man, with a gentle tilt that made the silhouette feel maternal. It knelt, he said. Brushed the needles off my body the way a mother smooths your hair. I could see Mark's dad shifting in his chair as he described the creature's movement. Exact, deliberate, terrifying in its tenderness. It picked me up. I weighed nothing. Carried me back toward the cabin like you carry a sleeping child. Before it set me down, it touched my forehead, like when a mother checks if you have a fever. And then, it dissolved back into the pines. There's a line in that memory where your brain tries to decide whether to file it as terror or comfort. Calvin didn't use the word Sasquatch at first. He used the word she. He said that back then he didn't think in terms of what we'd name it. He was a kid who knew wood, weather, and the exact grief of a house that had lost a father. To him, that creature was a presence with a loss that looked like theirs. As Mark's father talked, the night around our fire tightened. He said that for years the siblings kept waking up in that same spot, always returned by whatever watched the forest. It never hurt us, he said. Not once. Never a scratch. Never scared us or took us. It always placed us. Always at home. He admitted he never told his mother. If he had, she would have moved them, maybe abandoned the small life she'd built. She would have panicked. So I kept quiet. I asked the question that hangs heavy in these kinds of stories. Why return the kids? Why not carry them off somewhere else? Calvin shrugged again. Maybe she was a mother the only way she knew how. Maybe she lost a child once and that hum opened a space where she could put that loss. And the pull wasn't bad. Or maybe the forest liked how we smelled. Skin salt. The small loud noise kids make. And that's why it kept us close. We can tell stories, but the why isn't ours. There was a practicality in his words that made the strange feel more human. Grief, habit, odd needs. And when he said, I didn't see her again, not beyond that night, his voice went soft. Then he added that those pines and straight rows weren't natural. They'd made rooms where the light never changed. Maybe that was where old things sat down and stayed still. We sat quiet for a while after he finished. The lake answered with the dull slap of a fish. I thought about modern hikers who laugh at local legends, who post GPS coordinates and selfies and bring noise into places that are supposed to stay quiet. Calvin's last lines were a mix of warning and prayer. You can still hear the hum off Red Squirrel Road when the dust comes, he said. Some people call it a lullaby. Others say it's Satan or an elf or whatever the city invents to scare itself. Around here we say, don't fall asleep under strange trees if you can help it. But if you do, be ready for the world to decide what it'll do with you. There's a particular humility in that, the acceptance that humans aren't always the narrators of our own life. I left that trip with the image of a 9-year-old boy carried like a baby and a woman thing returning to the dark like it belonged there. Whether you chalk it up to deep sleep, a dream state walked through by unknown hands, or something whose inside you can't understand, the story stays in the same place as anything true. It forces you to pay attention. Later, when I asked Calvin if he thought that creature was a Sasquatch, he let out a small laugh, without wind. If you like names, call it whatever you want. I call her a mother. We all need someone to set us down gently, even the forest. I guess practical respect means leaving the wild to its own care. Listen to old warnings and understand that certain kindnesses and certain dangers in nature refuse to be explained. When you walk through someone else's territory, do it slowly. Something might lull you that remembers you better than you remember yourself. Story 5. Long before I went back to northern British Columbia, before the nightmares, the legal notices, and those strange voices calling me by my name, I used to believe my family's darkness ended with my parents' divorce. I spent most of my 20s convincing myself the past was a locked room I'd never have to open again. My uncle Marcus was part of that idea, an old wound, a name no one said out loud. When I was 9, I spent a summer at his hunting cabin near Topley. The night we left, my father and he argued. A shouting match so fierce the world outside the truck windows seemed to shrink. I never saw Marcus again. I thought that was the end of it. But the past has its own way of finding you, even when you don't want it to. I was 32 and living in Vancouver, newly single, newly fired, and sleeping barely 4 hours a night because of dreams that twisted into shapes I didn't know how to describe. Then a letter arrived. Thick paper, government seal, addressed formally to Mr. Andrew Carver. My uncle had died under unusual circumstances, and I had inherited his cabin. I stared at the page so long the words blurred. Part of me wanted to burn the letter. Another part, lonely, exhausted, desperate for direction, started packing a duffel bag. I told myself I just needed space. A long drive, a quiet place to think. I wish that had been true. The farther north I drove, the quieter the forested coast became. Snow clung to the branches like it didn't want to fall. Every mile felt heavier, as if the woods themselves leaned in closer. By the time I reached the turnoff onto Crown land, the air felt wrong, thick, still, like the world was holding its breath. Marcus's cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The roof line sagged, the windows frosted over despite the mild afternoon. The tree line behind it twisted like a row of broken teeth. There were no tracks, not even animal sign. I slid the key into the lock. When I opened the door, the hinges groaned like something was waking up. Inside it was warm, an unnatural warmth. The stove was cold, untouched. Thick dust sat on the table and shelves. And still I felt a faint current of heat on my face, like someone had been there minutes ago. Then I heard footsteps, soft, above me. I looked up at the attic hatch, nailed shut, sealed with 4 heavy, rusted nails that clearly hadn't been touched in years. Rodents, I muttered. Even though those steps didn't sound like rodents, they sounded deliberate. I pushed it out of my mind, told myself I was overreacting. I dropped my bag on the floor and lit a fire even though the place didn't need it. Maybe I just wanted to hold on to something normal. Night fell fast. Fog slid against the glass in long ribbons. I was sitting at the table eating straight from a can when from outside a sound reached me. A hum barely audible, a soft crooning. My blood went cold. It was a lullaby. Lillian's lullaby. "Andy," a voice whispered from the fog. "I'm cold. Let me in." The spoon slipped from my hand. Lillian had been dead for 2 years. I froze, unable to breathe. At first I tried to convince myself it was wind or old branches creaking, but the voice came back, closer, clearer, unmistakably hers. "Please, Andy, I need you." I backed away from the door. "You're not real," I whispered. "You can't be real." Silence answered. I didn't sleep that night. Every few hours, the attic thudded slow and heavy, like something crawling on all fours. At dawn, I opened Marcus's old wardrobe, hoping to find blankets. But I found something else, a loose floorboard. Curiosity won. Underneath were journals, dozens of them. They smelled like smoke, pine, and something metallic. I spent the morning reading, and the further I got, the more my skin prickled. The cabin hadn't been built for hunting. It had been raised as a containment structure designed by a forgotten indigenous sect that believed an entity without form lived beneath those woods. Something that mimicked the dead, something that fed on recognition. Marcus wrote about the warden, a role passed down the Roar bloodline, someone chosen each generation to occupy the cabin so the thing below would remain asleep. The rules were scratched out in furious handwriting. Never open the doors after dark. Ignore anything in the attic. It is not human. Keep the basement locked. It is its mouth. Do not answer anyone who says they are Marcus. My heart pounded so hard the journal shook in my hands. Something had called my name all night. The next afternoon, I heard my mother. Her voice drifted through the fog like a memory made alive. "Andy, sweetheart, I miss you." My mother had been dead for 10 years. She whispered secrets from my childhood that only she and I shared. Details no imitation could know. I clapped my hands over my ears and screamed until my throat burned. When her voice faded, I looked out the window. There were footprints circling the cabin. Small, barefoot, perfectly spaced. But the snow around the property was untouched. It kept falling in soft, distant flakes that never reached the ground. Like the forest refused to brush this place. I broke. I yanked on my coat and tried to leave, but every trail I took led back to the same stump. No matter how far I walked, the cabin always reappeared between the trees, like a patient shadow. My phone stopped working completely, the screen filled with meaningless symbols. The truck wouldn't start. The engine didn't even try. I was trapped. That night, the basement door shook hard, something pulling the knob with careful, eager energy. I jammed a chair against it, trembling. "Marcus," a voice moaned from the other side. "Help me. It's me. You left me." Without answering, I kept repeating to myself, gripping the table. "Don't answer. Don't answer. Don't answer." The voice finally stopped, but the scratching went on until dawn. On the 5th day, desperation weighed more than fear. I opened the basement. The air that rose to meet me was thick and hot, like it was breathing inside an open mouth. I went down. The steps creaked. The walls were covered in carvings. Names, dates, warnings. Journals from earlier wardens lay scattered across a stone table. Some were in English. Others were in old languages I didn't recognize. On the back wall, a message had been carved so deeply it had splintered the wood. "When you hear yourself calling your own name, never answer." My stomach turned because in my nightmares over the last year I had heard myself calling, "Andy." "Andy," something whispered behind me. I spun around. The flashlight flickered and then steadied. There was no one there, but the floor vibrated softly as if something below was settling deeper into sleep. I ran upstairs, slammed the door, and locked the basement again. In the nights that followed, the entity grew bolder. It didn't just mimic voices anymore. It made shapes. Shadows slid under door frames. My reflection in the glass started blinking out of sync. Once, while I was trying to write in my notebook, a hand, my hand, rapped on the window from outside, and every night the attic shook harder. I said the rules out loud whenever fear started winning. The entity recoiled from them as if words had weight. "I am the warden," I'd whisper. "I keep the door closed. I don't answer." The more I said it, the less the thing seemed to understand me, like the rules were the only language it couldn't mimic. But then I understood the truth. I couldn't leave. Marcus hadn't been working up there. He'd been serving a sentence, and now it was my turn. The weeks blurred. My beard grew in uneven. My hands shook all the time. The voices took turns. Lillian, my mother, my younger self, my father, even friends I'd lost over the years. Each one tried to pry open the part of me that still believed in hope. "Just let me in," Lillian would whisper. One night she added, "We can be together again." I squeezed my eyes shut. "You're not her." "Then who am I copying, Andy?" she asked softly. "You miss her. I can feel it." I threw my journal at the door just to drown her out. One afternoon, while fog climbed the porch like fingers, I noticed another name carved faintly in the margin of a journal. Melissa Bell, a cousin I barely remembered. A quiet girl at family gatherings, stuck close to her parents. I hadn't seen her since childhood. Marcus had written, with an asterisk, "If Andy can't hold, the cabin will call Melissa next. Tell her to be ready. Tell her to listen to the rules." My breath caught. It came out trembling. I started documenting everything. Dates, sounds, carvings, traps, the tricks the entity used, the changes in the cabin's temperature, the way the forest folded in on itself. Maybe someday Melissa would find my journals the way I found Marcus's. Maybe they'd help save her. Tonight, as I write this last entry, the fog has taken shape beside the window. Broad shoulders, tired eyes, the same jacket I'm wearing right now. It smiles slightly, like someone who already knows the ending. "Andy," it whispers in my own voice, "it's time to trade places." And for the first time, I understand it completely. I'm not protecting the cabin. I'm replacing its last prisoner. The entity isn't just learning my voice. It's learning my time, piece by piece, until it can wear my face like a key. I don't know how much I have left. But before the voice outside is perfect, before it convinces the next person to open the door, I need to finish writing. Melissa, if this place ever speaks your name, don't answer. Turn around and run. And whatever you do, never open the door after dark. Evil rarely arrives like a monster. It arrives like memory, like comfort, like something familiar enough for you to trust. Listening to the wrong voice, even one that sounds like home, can trap you in a place you never leave. Trust your instincts, question what calls you, and don't open a door just because it knew how to say your name. Story 6. Long before I decided that a weekend in the woods would do me good, I kept telling myself that survival looked like small, sensible things. Avoiding highways at night, sitting in the passenger seat if panic hit, breathing through the noise until it passed. Last year's crash taught me the shape of sudden terror. A sedan spun out, someone screamed, and time folded until all that was left was a silence that settled heavy inside my chest. Since then, quiet places, parks, lakes, dim back roads, helped me breathe again. Summer Reeves knew that about me. She also knew I didn't know how to tell her no when she talked about abandoned things. Summer studies ecology and treats ruins like field labs. She loves how a collapsed barn fills with life again between its beams, how an old foundation becomes new housing for moss. She called me on a Thursday and said, "Aaron, Papineau Lake this weekend. I found something weird in the county records. Are you okay? I need a weekend." I lied, but I meant it too. The idea of a cathedral of birch and maple, the click of my camera shutter, and Summer's constant steady chatter sounded like therapy. We drove north in Summer's beat-up Subaru. The GPS flickered. The radio cut out and came back with a kind of static that made your teeth ache. At one point, we passed a row of half-collapsed cottages with hand-painted signs that read, "No trespassing, leave it alone." The letters flaked like old scabs. They looked older than anyone still living out that way. We joked about rural superstitions. I laughed, but my laugh felt small. We parked where the gravel ended and followed a deer track into a forest so quiet it felt consecrated. We walked for an hour under a green ceiling of branches until Summer stopped. She pointed. "There," she whispered. In a clearing cut through with sunlight, a bench sat half buried in moss. Rotten boards sagged like ribs. Initials carved into the armrest twisted into strange shapes. I didn't recognize the characters. They looked more like scratches than letters. My stomach turned as I photographed it. My hands shook and I blamed the light filtering between the trees. 50 yards farther, a rusted chain-link fence formed a small rectangle around what at first looked like branches dropped by the wind. And then as we got closer, the shacks arranged themselves into view. Dozens of them. Driftwood, sheet metal, camper wall panels, signs, even the door of a refrigerator, all assembled into structures so tiny you'd have to crouch to go inside. The windows were clogged with weeds. One shack had a little porch with a teacup balanced on the edge and a ring of plastic flowers stuck to the wood by moss. "This," Summer breathed. "This isn't right," I said. The camera felt heavy against my chest. We pushed aside a rotten door. Inside, a Santa Claus statue stared blankly from where someone had chiseled out its eyes. Faded religious pamphlets lay beside dented lockers and a cracked ceramic angel. A carousel horse slumped under a tarp near a half-buried ticket booth. Everything smelled like wet paper, old varnish, and something sweet and cloying, like cotton candy left out in the rain. "Maybe kids built them," Summer offered. "Kids don't build with road signs and oven doors," I said. "And why would they hang mannequins in the trees?" We found the mannequins when we rounded a stand of birches. Dozens of them hung, sat, or lay half-buried. Headless torsos blotched by sun, arms twisted and tied. Some were charred on one side, like an old fire had licked them. A few wore sequined vests, cracked masks, and torn ruffled collars. A clown shoe curled upward, like someone had stepped on it and then forgotten it. The sight made a noise inside my chest that wasn't exactly sadness or fear. It was a deep bone-level wrongness, something that didn't fit. Summer stepped closer, her phone flashlight bobbing. It looks like an abandoned set or like a town for people too small to stand up," I said. "Or people who stopped growing," she laughed, and the sound was too bright. "Aaron, no. We should have turned around right there. We didn't." The place had a pull that felt like being examined under a magnifying glass. I aimed my camera at a moss-covered mannequin. I liked how film captured foreign textures, how a photograph could be proof that something existed. The mannequin was missing its head, but a piece of costume clung to its neck like a wound. Then the crackling started, the scuffing. Behind one of the shacks, Summer froze. "Probably a raccoon," she mouthed. I didn't like how the air thickened between my shoulder blades. I felt pressure behind my eyes, like the world had tightened down to a thread. I could have sworn I saw one of the mannequins move when there was no wind. "Let's go," I said. And this time my voice didn't shake. We backtracked. The path felt longer on the way out, and the shacks threw shadows that looked like rows of seated people. Branches scratched our arms. My fingers found new scrapes along the camera strap, marks that hadn't been there before. When we finally reached the start of the track, 2 Ontario provincial police cruisers were blocking the gravel. The officers stood beside their vehicles, breath steaming. And suddenly we both realized something. We'd been holding our breath. The taller officer's posture was tired. The other one's eyes were too quick. "Are you two going onto private property?" the tall one asked. "We were hiking," Summer said. "We didn't see any signs." "A property owner called," the shorter one cut in. "They reported people in the woods. I need your IDs." I handed over my license and Summer gave hers. I offered to show them the photos. The tall officer's jaw tightened when I opened the gallery. He looked at the phone like he could smell something through the glass. "You two need to leave and not come back," he said flat. "We're going to file a report." "A report for what?" I asked. "We found—" "Just go," the shorter officer snapped and handed my phone back after holding it a beat longer than felt appropriate. "If you want, you can show this at the station, but right now you're being told to move along." The impatience in his voice dropped my stomach. Why the rush? Why that edge? On the drive home, we barely talked. At one point, Summer found my hand and squeezed, like she was trying to anchor us to normal. I scrolled through the photos on my phone with trembling thumbs. Looking closely, some of the images had timestamps that didn't match the day. One photo read 1972. Another read 1954. Years before we were born. "Must be a glitch," Summer said. I wanted to believe it. I deleted the older one and the date didn't change, but the metadata did. Sometimes in the background of the photos, a new face appeared. A tall, thin figure among the shacks, hunched watching. I could have sworn I didn't see it when I took the shot. Summer swore she didn't either. Months later, I did what anyone with access to county archives would do. I dug around. Online, there were murmurs about a traveling troupe that camped around Papineau Lake in the 1950s and 60s. A small circus that performed at rural fairs until a fire or a scandal, depending on who you asked, ran them out. There were no definitive records to confirm the story. On a forum, some locals whispered about ritual shows, about a group that didn't leave but shrank into the forest to perform for no one. A couple commenters warned about the tiny houses and the watchers in the trees. Most of the posts were half joke, half barroom ghost story. I kept the photos to myself. I printed a few and shoved them in a drawer. Sometimes the file dates would shift again, sliding backward to years before I existed. Once, the camera's serial number in the image metadata changed to something completely different. I looked for comfort wherever I could. Digital glitches, I told myself. Summer called it the good kind of mystery. There's one photo in particular I can't explain. We were standing at the edge of a ring of tiny porches when I photographed a door with a teacup on the step. When I reviewed the image later, I saw a tall, twisted silhouette beyond one of the shacks. Long arms, head tilted like it was listening to a distant string. Its presence felt deliberate, like it knew I'd be looking for it later. I still feel it at night, the imprint of eyes on the back of my neck. I stopped going back to Papineau. Summer tried twice, but something in the officer's look, from the district, from the detachment, made her back off. We both breathed easier once we were back in the city. Still, sometimes when my apartment is too quiet and night presses against the closed windows, I scroll through those photos again and catch the silhouette between the shacks. I imagine the way it tilts its head. Sometimes I think I hear the muffled rhythm of a carnival melody that never quite becomes music. I've never shown those photos publicly. You don't share things like that unless you're ready for them to file it under madness. Or worse, under the kind of thing people prefer to pretend doesn't exist. Some places keep their history very close, and some stories are better left unmoved. Curiosity can reveal the truth, yes, but it can also expose you to things that learned to watch a long time ago. Trust what your body tells you when a place feels wrong. Some doors were closed for a reason. Story 7. Long before that rainy night at the casino became something that stayed living under my skin, I'd already learned to carry guilt like a stone in your pocket. It was small and heavy, and it showed in the way you reached for a door or in how you looked away when someone needed you. That summer I was 12, old enough to know better, and young enough to believe I could still fix things. The memory that stuck in me, the bullying in the schoolyard that I didn't stop, was a bright splinter. After that, I started watching more closely. I checked doors. I stayed glued to my mother when crowds formed. I thought vigilance was a kind of penance. We drove from Seattle to Richmond for a long weekend. The River Rock Casino had just opened. burning in neon like a small city on the Fraser. My dad loved blackjack. My mom collected casino coffee mugs like trophies. And my older sister, Clara, got carsick easily. So she curled up in the back seat with a paper bag while I got to explore the basement arcade. For a 12-year-old, the arcade felt enormous. Rows of machines that smelled like coins and fried food, the sharp click of joysticks, screens flashing like tiny suns. I sat up in front of a shooter game and let competition feel like therapy. It was loud, and it was safe, in the way noise can become a complete distraction. I told myself I could relax. Then I saw two teenagers across the room arguing over a handful of stolen tokens. Their voices were just a hiss of static to me, until a figure stepped between them, pale as a ghost under the glow of the screens. He was maybe 18, skinny and absurdly neat for that place. Pressed dress pants, loafers, a blue shirt tucked in like someone had ironed him top to bottom. I remember the shoes because of how wrong they looked on the scuffed floor. Shiny and private in a room made for sticky fingers and clumsy tourists. He walked toward the girls' bathroom right after a little girl went in. His stride was slow and deliberate, like a metronome someone had overwound and now let tick down. I felt that pinch, the same one I had carried since the schoolyard. My stomach clenched and the world narrowed into a single wrong thing. I remember thinking, this isn't right. "Mom," I said. She was half celebrating a bonus on a slot machine, fingers still on the lever. "Maybe he's looking for his sister," she answered without looking away. She patted my shoulder without thinking and fed another coin in when the machine spit one out. My mom was the kind of person who loved bustle, the possibility of a small win. Her shrug sounded like permission I didn't want. Minutes later, I saw him again through the glass doors that led to the parking lot. He was out there, adjusting his cuffs, watching rain begin to run down the neon. He looked perfectly composed, calm to the point of excess when he lifted his head. Our eyes met for half a second. I remember thinking his pupils had nothing in them. He looked like a mannequin that had been loaned life for an instant. And then the scream tore the room open. It was a single sound, thin, that cut through the arcade and made the screen lights falter. Security ran toward the bathrooms. People grabbed their kids and pressed them to their chests. There was no time to process anything else. My father's hand dropped on my shoulder hard enough to bruise as he said, "We're leaving right now." The rush to the car was survival in motion, practiced impatience. We got into the vehicle under drizzle while police sirens stitched the night. Clara was pale, her hands trembling. She whispered, I don't know if to me or to the air, "A guard. He threw up. Alex, I saw it. She couldn't say more. My dad didn't ask any questions. He drove like the road was a straight arrow away from danger. On the way back, the neon fell behind us, stretched by the rain. I couldn't stop thinking about the polished loafers, the way the boy walked, that metronome step. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but my parents were wrapped in their own relief, in their own excuses. My mother murmured about crowds, about panic, about how impossible it was to stop everything. My father gripped the steering wheel with his jaw locked. No one listened for long. For years I tried to forget it, or at least file it away as a fragment of noise and fear. I told myself my memory was imperfect, that maybe I'd misread his neatness, that my imagination had built a villain out of discomfort. I grew up, moved to Toronto, and life pushed the edges of that night deeper into the background. Work, relationships, the slow erosion of certainties that used to shine. And still, sometimes a smell, a shoe in a store window, a blue shirt hanging on a rack, would sand the memory down until it was alive again. 20 years later, on a morning that began like any other, I read an article that stole my breath. It detailed a 1997 case at the River Rock, a name I knew but had never connected to that night until that paragraph. A 7-year-old girl, Marissa Hartley, had been murdered in the casino bathroom that same year. The perpetrator, Jeremiah Stone, who was 18 at the time. The article was careful and clinical. Dates, court proceedings, a diagnosis, dissociative episodes, violent delusions discovered later. Witnesses described him as someone without emotion, neat, moving like he was somewhere else. They'd seen him murmuring about voices telling him to follow the girl who didn't belong there before the attack. And then, just as chilling, he acted normal afterward. Walked out, adjusted his cuffs, and headed for the parking lot. My hands went cold on the newspaper. The description of that neatness, the loafers, the pressed pants, pulled a wire tight inside my memory. The details of that night yanked at me with an accuracy that felt like a trap closing. I hadn't imagined the pressed look. I'd seen it. I'd seen him. I kept reading. The article pointed out something strange investigators found. In his statements, he said he didn't remember anything. And in other reports, he talked about following the girl who didn't belong. An obsessive phrase that made my scalp prickle. The casino's name had been changed the following year, amid the trauma. A small bureaucratic move that, for survivors, felt like a bandage slapped crooked over a wound. The pain wasn't just having witnessed evil. It was realizing how close it had been. I'd passed beside a man who would kill a child minutes later. I'd orbited a tragedy larger than my childhood guilt. For 2 decades, I carried the image of that neat boy like a question nobody said out loud. Did I miss something? Could I have stepped between him and the bathroom door? The questions were practical and useless, impossible to answer now. But the mind goes back again and again to the last frame as if you could splice another strip into the reel and change the outcome. That night, I remember a flash I'd insisted on blaming on a trick of the rain. As we drove off, I thought I saw his reflection in the window, smiling toward the empty highway, with only streetlights and puddles around. I told myself it was guilt inventing a specter. Now that smile felt like a verdict. Sometimes I dream about the arcade. It's the same pattern of lights and noise, but after the scream, the room empties in a strange way. The machines go dark, except for one. The attendant lowers his head. A slot machine doesn't spit out any coins. In the dream, the boy in loafers passes behind my shoulder, slow as a clock hand, and leans close enough that I feel the heat of a breath that isn't breath. He always whispers in the same thin, accusing tone I still hear when I wake up. You should have stopped me. There are mornings I wake up with my heart climbing into my throat, and I wonder what it means to have been a witness. The legal answer is simple. Witnesses testify, provide evidence, help justice happen. But real life doesn't always fit into the comfort of the legal. Sometimes witnesses are sentenced to the silence of their remembered choices. I've tried to go forensic, to be useful. I volunteered in community safety programs, testified supporting victims in other cases, spoke openly about de-escalation in my neighborhood. I wanted to turn that pain into action. That helped on some nights. But the question that refuses to shut up is older than any law. What are you supposed to see? Sometimes it feels like the cruelty of fate, that certain eyes are dragged toward the scene as proof or as punishment for being alive in the wrong place at the wrong time. Other times I feel less metaphysical and more mundane. Proximity, chance, the senseless lottery of attention. I have to sleep with both ideas, like 2 different stones under my pillow. I never crossed paths with Jeremiah Stone in any courtroom. He left a crater in someone else's family and a faint echo of horror in mine. When I close my eyes, I don't picture his face. What comes back are the loafers, the neat shirt, the mechanical step. Somehow they're more monstrous than any caricature. Ordinary things, with no reason to alarm anyone, unless, in that moment, you knew how to read them. If there's a lesson, it's small and urgent. Pay attention, yes, but be ready for the ways attention can chase you. We can't always intervene. What we can do is carry what we learn forward, into the work we choose to do and the conversations we choose not to dodge. Vigilance isn't penance, even if it feels like it. It's practice. Practice to act, to speak, to not let silence become a comfortable garment. Sometimes in downtown rain, when I pass a man in loafers, I look twice. It isn't a solution. It isn't guilt. It's a way to keep the memory honest, to honor what was lost in a place that no longer carries the name I knew. Seeing isn't the same as stopping, and guilt by itself doesn't measure moral worth. Use what you witness to learn, to act where you can, and to make room for others. Because attention without action turns sour and becomes regret. But action, even imperfect action, can break cycles.